just for 5 to 9 turbines. If we reach 1,000 megawatts, which we project will be the tipping point, to use the name of Eric's company, to reduce the cost of offshore wind power by 50%, the jobs to support 1,000 megawatts in Lake Erie will be about 2,000 to 3,000 jobs, basically the same as an auto assembly plant. If we have modest success by 2035 or 2040 of 5,000 megawatts in the lake, we basically project 10,000 to 12,000 jobs. That's 3 to 4 auto plants. The other thing we know at LeadCo that's driving us is, one, we're the only community-driven project that we know of anywhere in North America. Two, LeadCo has been the only project that was selected to receive a grant from the DOE in the amount of $4 million for this year to work on regulatory matters and finance models for power purchase agreements. There are 6 other projects, 4 in the Atlantic, 1 in the Gulf of Mexico, and I think, if my math is right, 1 or 2 in the Pacific. Doesn't really matter. If we are successful this year, the DOE will select 3 of those 7 projects to receive $47 million each over the next 2 to 5 years. Why is that important? It dovetails into developing a technology that is not a new technology, because Europe has had offshore wind for 20 years. It happens to be a $400 billion market, by the way, in Europe. If we develop the Great Lakes and certain portions of the Atlantic for offshore wind, we see similar growth numbers overall. Why is government subsidy, which also equates to Senate Bill 221, important? Oh, by the way, I want to recognize my friend Bill Spratley at Green Energy Ohio. Without him in the very early days, LeadCo wouldn't exist, because Green Energy Ohio did the project that measured wind speed out at the Cleveland water intake crypt. So thank you, Bill, and thank you, Green Energy Ohio. That's some of the economic data. Let me talk a little bit about Senate Bill 221 and the Renewable Energy Portfolio Standard. For new industries, some kind of public investment is necessary, because private sector risk capital markets simply don't have the appetite to develop those technologies. Of course, those subsidies have to go away as soon as possible, because if you don't have a sustainable market model, the industry shouldn't survive in the first place. But another statistic that I've learned in the energy practice over the last many years is that it takes literally 40 years to go from a technology like wind turbines to really make it utility scale and acceptance on a global basis or a national basis. So there's a long sales cycle to develop it, and therefore public investment is necessary to prime the pump. Bottom line, without Senate Bill 221, LeadCo probably wouldn't exist. I might even venture to say that onshore wind development and much of the manufacturing in Ohio that has come from the wind industry around the country would not exist. To my knowledge, there is no significant wind development, meaning projects, or wind manufacturing in states that do not have a renewable energy portfolio standard. So Senate Bill 221 is very, very fundamental to succeeding in our modest goal of building an offshore wind industry in the Great Lakes.
Thanks, Dave. I want to pick up on that, because you laid out some pretty big numbers there, and it was pretty heavy numbers there, so I just want to pick up on that a little bit. So could you talk a little bit more, I mean, you talked a little bit about projections that you have in terms of 1,000 megawatts leading up to 3,000 jobs, policy as a driver, and the risk capital that comes with the surety that comes through something like 221. Could you talk a little bit also about what the supply chain effect of these kinds of developments are here, the manufacturing and things of that nature, the catalyzing effect that developments such as LEEDCO, such as onshore wind developments have in terms of the manufacturing sector, and the kind of crossover a little bit between different energy sectors and other markets, other manufacturing sectors. You know, I've heard, for instance, that a wind turbine has many of the same things that go into an automobile, for instance. There are gears and transmissions and so on and so forth. So could you talk a little bit about supply chain, manufacturing, and things of that nature?
Oh, you shouldn't have got me started. Yes, absolutely, Scott. And anybody else, feel free to chime in if you wish. First, Ohio is second only to California already in the supply chain in terms of manufacturing pieces, parts, subsystems in the supply chain. There are over 394 companies throughout the state that already participate in this industry. The basis for that is, frankly, since the population of wind turbines in Ohio is still pretty darn small, even with the Arbidrola project in northwest Ohio, is that goes back to one of the things I said earlier, and that is, without states taking the lead to implement renewable energy portfolio standards, the demand that feeds those companies in the supply chain would not exist. So if we really want to maintain our technical and manufacturing and I'll say technical prowess for making things, the wind industry, solar industry too, demand response equipment and things like that, same thing, energy efficiency, John. All of this stuff, there would be no demand for if there were not renewable energy portfolio standards among the states. Because frankly, at the federal level, we don't have much of an energy policy, and the federal government has never been able to really put into place a national renewable energy portfolio standard for a lot of reasons that if you read the headlines, I think you can see some of the paralysis down in Washington. The other thing, Scott, that comes to mind is that people say, well, you know, why do you have to have that expensive power in the lake? Why do you have to have it onshore in Ohio? Why don't we just make things and ship cards and export them to Texas or North Dakota or Iowa or what have you? The answer to that is that the studies show that most of the jobs go to places where there are actually wind farms or wind projects. The high-value systems are large systems. The turbines themselves are large, sophisticated, computer-controlled pieces of equipment. They're not just big pinwheels on a stick. And the costs involved of transporting these major systems and subsystems around is very, very expensive, as you can imagine. In fact, for offshore wind, one of the thoughts is that trucks probably can't even carry a lot of these systems or subsystems. It's got to be rail or ship. And so the fact of the matter is, if you have projects, you'll have jobs. And if we want jobs in Ohio, we have to have projects here in addition to the manufacturing infrastructure we already have. Does that answer your question?
This is my question. Anybody else want to build on that?
I would just add that I think the point is valid. We tend to spend a lot of time on where are things being made, which is certainly important, but the majority of jobs in the solar business are downstream from there. They're the installation, they're design, they're the engineering, they're the financing jobs. That is a larger portion than the actual manufacturing.
That's a good point, Eric. The other thing I might suggest, I'd like to hear whether it's true in solar installations too. For offshore wind, if you break down what these jobs look like, yeah, there's some high-tech jobs and highfalutin jobs which require a lot of education and stuff like that. But the logistics, the transport, building the foundations, getting it out in the water, the operations and maintenance, those you can do with high school degree plus training or an associate's degree, let alone a bachelor's degree. So, you know, this is a very democratic industry. It's not an elitist industry.
Yeah, pretty much the same. It spans that, but a lot of it is what we would traditionally think of as construction work.
Okay, so let me build off on that then. So are we, if the workforce of the future, is the workforce of the future primarily blue-collar jobs, or are these jobs coming out of colleges and universities, Kevin? Are we training the workforce of the future for the clean energy economy? Does everybody have to have a mechanical engineering degree or an aerospace engineering degree to design and build these things? I'm asking an unfair question of a mechanical engineer, so
it's obvious.
Yeah.
It's obviously not the case. Our expertise is in the energy efficiency area, and to some extent, the design and integration of renewable energy systems into the world. I mean, on the design side, that's our domain, but advanced energy, clean energy brings in lots of other skills and abilities. Even in my company, we have 2 computer scientists, 3 computer scientists just coming on. We have communications experts. We have a business development person. The energy piece is actually 2 of us. You know, the rest of it is our other types of my Dropoli business is professional business for now, but I think you guys can speak to this probably just as well.
So, just a slightly different take on this from the EnerNOC perspective. I didn't mention at the beginning that EnerNOC was founded in 2001 with 2 employees, a non-employee 110. I joined in 06, and now we're over 700 employees. But the demand response business is data and communications intensive rather than capital fixed project intensive. So we install servers out at every customer's site. We're hooked up to 1,000 sites in Ohio alone. Every one of those sites has a server that's sending data back to our control rooms. And so, at least in our portion of the industry, a lot of the jobs are programmers, to be honest with you. We hire a lot of programmers to be able to handle the billions of points of data we're receiving every day.
So this is an IT business, basically.
It is. Our business wouldn't exist. I like to say that our business takes the advances in computing and telecommunications that happened in the 1990s and applied them to the electric industry in the 2000s. But without wireless, without cloud computing, without cheap sensor devices, we wouldn't be able to control the demand at all these different customers. And so we've had to, like I said, I bet the majority of the people that we hire are either local salespeople and installation people, or they're programmers.
Is this the grid of the future?
The grid of the future is going to have a lot more intelligence built into it, and that's going to be, it's like microchips in location, that have to be programmed at the factory to other larger, control systems. But the electric industry, frankly, has been not on the cutting edge of applying computing and communications, and it's now catching up. And that, I think, these technologies that were developed for other industries are being applied, and that's a lot of when you hear about the smart grid, that's what's going on.
Yeah. Well, can I just add? So, Scott, you asked how are universities being adaptive, and I think you make a really good point. We can be a lot better, and we can be much more cost-effective in how we deliver energy reduction and renewable energy to comply with State Bill 221 and even surpass expectations of State Bill 221. I think information is really key and central. Utilizing, expanding our analytics capability based on information. I know our program has added an energy informatics kind of component to the curriculum. You're seeing, the industry move from kind of an assessment capability or assessment of energy effectiveness in our communities with an auditor on the ground to kind of more an automated, do it quick, do it fast, do it cheap approach. This is happening on a rapid pace. And so, yeah, I'd say in terms of educational adaptation, the information piece, adding this into the advanced energy mix is really the future.
Just a couple of comments. You said, okay, are the jobs of the future going to be blue-collar jobs? Yes and no. The thing that we're seeing, and LEEDCO is also working with Ed Weston with the Great Lakes Wind Network, which is basically a supply chain organization funded by Jobs Ohio, as well as some other foundations and others in the supply chain, to look at where the workforce development opportunities are. And the blue-collar jobs of the 21st century are not the blue-collar jobs of the 20th century. They're not just brawn, you gotta have brains as well. You gotta be able to have some basic skills in computers and data and running sophisticated machinery. These wind turbines are very, very sophisticated. And to the extent that I'm listening to Rick's comments, that if you're going to balance the grid properly with renewable sources like solar or wind, you have to have sophisticated analytics to balance the grid, and it's both supply and demand. And all of that interconnection and that equipment has to be maintained by folks that either climb the towers or go out in the lake or man the operation centers of these solar and wind farms. The other thing that I'll suggest is that you don't need to have a bachelor's degree or necessarily graduate from Kevin's program to succeed. For example, Lorraine Community College has one of the first wind turbine technician programs east of Mississippi, if I'm not mistaken. And Duncan East up there is training basically high school graduates, 2-year folks with associate's degrees, how to be sophisticated technical workers.
Okay. So, so I have a vested interest in this myself, working for a university myself, and I think you answered the question that actually was on the tip of my mind, which is, it's not just a 4-year degree, it's not an advanced degree, it's a 2-year degree, sometimes it's an apprenticeship, and so.
It could be a PhD too, depending.
Okay. And the question is, does Ohio have our stuff together? Is that all knit together pretty tightly? I assume it's all knit together pretty tightly, and we're doing a good job.
Yes, you're doing a good job.
I think the community colleges are doing an excellent job. So Lorraine, Cincinnati State, Sinclair,
Hocking Hills.
Hocking Hills, yeah.
We could always do better.
Yeah. Is Jane Harf here tonight?
No, she's not.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the alliance among universities?
Sure, I could very briefly. About 6 years ago, the universities, all the public universities in the state, banded together and created an organization called the University Clean Energy Alliance of Ohio, or UCEAO. And the purpose of that organization is to get together and talk about and formulate plans to work collaboratively amongst the institutions of higher education. We've since been joined by the Association of Community Colleges and the Association of Independent Colleges, which expands out the original 13 members to darn near 100 or more different universities and colleges. And so I'm asking a very provocative question because as the former board chair of that organization, I know we have a lot of work to do in that regard, but the fact that an organization like UCAO exists is a testament to the fact that at least we're thinking proactively about this and trying to band together and trying to streamline those training programs as much as we possibly can.
In all seriousness, I think the universities in Ohio are building a very strong foundation. Of course, we need to do bigger, better, stronger, continuous improvement, to use a manufacturing term. One of the things I see that I'd love to hear from the panelists is, I think if Ohio is going to succeed, we need to learn to think creatively and innovatively and make connections and team building coalitions that haven't been thought about before. For example, a lot of people assume that because LEEDCO is developing offshore wind, we're not crazy about the natural gas boom in southeast or south central Ohio. Quite the contrary. We love natural gas because we know that the wind doesn't always blow. And to work productively with our utility partners, it's better to have natural gas peakers because it's easier to turn them on and off than coal or nukes. And so, you know, we're big fans of natural gas at LEEDCO. And frankly, all of the wind developers I work with. Natural gas is a good thing. It will not supplant wind. And at the same time, I don't think the state as a policy, you know, the legislature or the governor's office should say, well, we got all this natural gas, we'll stop investing in some of these new technologies, whether they're on efficiency, demand response, or on the supply side. You've got to have a strategy that takes advantages of all of your assets, maximize your strengths, minimize your weaknesses. Just my personal opinion.
We'll come back to that. I want to pick up on that a little bit. Rick, you mentioned earlier in your business model, in EnerNOC's business model, that demand response is responsible for saving $1+ billion recently in the PJM market, and 11.8, I believe, $billion nationwide. Explain to me, in layman's terms, how utilities make money selling fewer electrons, please.
Well, this is so my graduate degree is in public policy, and my master's thesis was on putting energy efficiency investments into the rate base for utilities. The point being, I was in graduate school a long time ago, and this question has not been resolved during my career. So the typical utility rate-making model is, or historically was, that the more kilowatt hours that were sold, the more the utility would take in as revenue. And this was a good thing because for a long time there was economies of scale of building things bigger and bigger. Because, help me out here, engineers, but the volume of a steam vessel increases to the cube of the diameter of the steam vessel or something like that, right? So you made bigger and bigger power plants, the price of power went down, there was incentives to sell more and more electricity. That's no longer the case in the electric industry. And it's more and more expensive to build new anything. And so there are different models being looked at across the country to help utilities, electric utilities, be able to minimize the cost to society while at the same time not being financially penalized. So there are a number of rate-making mechanisms that are talked about or used in different places, including you give an adder. If you do a good job on energy efficiency, you get paid extra. Rate-making mechanisms that adjust at the end of the year so you're not penalized for using less. As long as customers are better off, they're getting lower bills, then the price per kilowatt hour can go up a little bit. There are a number of different ways to do this. Different utilities in different states have different attitudes about it, but it is a lively topic at many public utility commissions across the country and many conferences. So there are ways to do it, but I don't think there's any one way that everybody said everybody's got to do it this way.
John, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I guess the only thing I'd add is what we traditionally think of as the utility in this state is kind of severed into generation companies and distribution companies. And so, you know, the generation companies, the companies that own the power plants now, there's a markets where you sell your kilowatt hours and your capacity, and at least in the capacity auction they're competing with demand response, with energy efficiency, and so their investors take a risk and they're at risk. And so, you know, I think the people up on this panel, we see the traditional generation companies as a bunch. You know, we're competing and we're looking to, you know, do what businesses do. The distribution utility is the lines. The lines are going to be there. If you're putting up solar or wind, or you're doing demand response or efficiency, those electrical lines are going to be there. I haven't heard anyone talk about a future when we're not going to have the electric grid. And so the cost of building and maintaining those lines, there's going to be a cost no matter what we do on generation or consumption. And so then the question is, how do you make sure that those regulated monopolies you know, recover the cost for maintaining those lines. Traditionally, it's been you charge based on kilowatt hours, and so I'm not that well schooled in all the different recovery mechanisms, but they exist. There's things like shared savings agreements where the utility gets incented to achieve more savings, and they get to recover some of the cost and recover some money for their shareholders. So, but I think that's one important thing to keep in mind here is that we're competing with traditional generation, but the regulated monopolies, the lines companies, DP&L and AP and Duke and even First Energy, they're going to be around for a long time, and ideally they would be partners with us or working with them.
Eric, you mentioned that the price of solar panels has fallen, I think you said 60% or so over the last couple of years. Are we reaching a point where generation from solar is getting toward that grid parity point with traditional coal fire and natural gas fired power?
Yes and no. I mean, grid parity is often talked about as sort of the holy grail, but it's a very the term is, it just depends where you are, right? If I am in Hawaii, then the answer is yes. Solar today is more cost competitive than most of the ways of making power there today, given the amount of sunlight there is and the amount of energy they have to import to the island and all that. Solar works today.
Based on market conditions?
Based on market conditions.
How about Ohio?
Ohio is further away, right? We've got relatively inexpensive power here. If the Ohio solar industry has any particular challenge, that's one of them, right? Is the same solar system in Ohio might produce energy that's worth 6, 7, 8 cents per kilowatt hour. That exact same system is going to produce energy worth 12, 13, 14 cents, per kilowatt hour out in the East Coast. So grid parity kind of is very shifting depending on a lot of different things. But it's getting there, and I do think that to a large part the genie is, we talk a lot about, at least a few years ago, I don't hear it so much about how the clean energy industry got off got off to a start in the 70s, and then we sort of pulled investment and the entire thing collapsed. And I think we're past that today as an industry. I think we are in need of continued smart policy and investments in the industry in order to make this state more competitive than the other state, to make this country more competitive than other countries. But I think that the tide has turned in that there's no real stopping all of this at this point. I mean, I think that the technologies are getting cheap enough. Traditional resources are, despite temporary blips and, we found a bunch of natural gas here for a little while, everything is more expensive to extract it. We pay a higher price environmentally as we go on. So the point will come in different places at different times where these different technologies, be it wind or solar or energy efficiency, are the default choice. We're starting to see communities in California that are starting to say, look, every new house needs to have solar energy. Because the price point is just, it makes a lot of sense as far as it's economically, it is the right thing to do for those communities as far as keeping their power prices in line and doing that sort of thing. So I think it's a matter of time everywhere. Ohio will be a little bit further down the line given where our power prices are today. But entering in an era of deregulation, who knows what things will look like in 3 years.
I'd be interested in your comments, Eric. Parity is a big challenge, I think, for everybody in renewables, certainly for the wind industry in general, offshore wind in particular, simply because of the initial capital cost that increased from being out in the water. One of the things that I think people lose sight of, especially skeptics that might not accept some of the other value propositions that we articulate, is that right now, especially in Ohio, the age of the utilities fleet is pretty darn old. And that means they can produce power pretty darn inexpensively because all those plants have been pretty much fully depreciated. And if you look at EPRI studies and things like that, the long-term curve in terms of energy prices from traditional sources, let alone renewables